In our age of information warfare, most citizens find themselves drowning in a sea of competing narratives, each claiming exclusive access to truth. Yet the very proliferation of certainties should make us suspicious. When everyone claims to possess the complete picture, we can be sure that complexity is being sacrificed for the sake of ideological comfort. The question is not which propaganda to believe, but how to develop the intellectual tools necessary to navigate between them. This requires what I learned to call methodological skepticism, not the paralysis of endless doubt, but the disciplined practice of examining our own assumptions as rigorously as we examine those of our opponents. Democracy depends not on citizens who believe the right things, but on citizens who know how to think. The challenge of our digital age has only intensified this fundamental problem. How do we maintain intellectual independence when sophisticated psychological manipulation masquerades as information? How do we distinguish between legitimate persuasion and propaganda designed to exploit our cognitive vulnerabilities? The stakes could not be higher. Democracy itself depends on citizens capable of rational deliberation about complex issues. Chapter 1: The Seductive Power of Ideological Certainty. The fundamental challenge of political thinking in democratic societies is learning to resist what I called the opium of the intellectuals, the intoxicating appeal of comprehensive worldviews that promise to explain everything. Whether progressive or conservative, these totalizing systems offer something profoundly attractive to the human mind, the illusion that complexity can be reduced to simple formulas, that moral ambiguity can be eliminated through the right theoretical framework, and that political action can be guided by scientific certainty rather than prudential judgment. I observed this phenomenon most clearly during the Cold War, when many of my intellectual contemporaries became so committed to anti-capitalist ideology that they systematically ignored or rationalized the obvious failures of Soviet communism. They possessed what they believed was a scientific theory of history that made their conclusions inevitable. The evidence of Stalinist brutality was not permitted to challenge their theoretical convictions. Instead, it was reinterpreted to fit their preconceived framework. Jean-Paul Sartre, for instance, could acknowledge Soviet labor camps while maintaining that criticism of the USSR objectively served capitalist interests and therefore should be suppressed. But this same pattern appears wherever political thinking becomes subordinated to ideological commitment. Conservative intellectuals can become equally blind to evidence that challenges their assumptions about markets, tradition, or national power. They develop elaborate theories about why income inequality is beneficial, why environmental concerns are exaggerated, or why military intervention always serves democratic values, regardless of empirical evidence to the contrary. Progressive activists can develop the same immunity to facts that contradict their beliefs about human nature, social justice, or historical progress, dismissing contrary evidence as products of false consciousness or systemic bias. The common element is not the content of the beliefs, but the psychological need to possess a complete system that eliminates uncertainty and moral complexity. Ideology functions like a drug because it provides relief from the anxiety of democratic choice. In a democracy, citizens must constantly make judgments about complex issues with incomplete information, weighing competing values and uncertain consequences. They must live with the knowledge that even well-intentioned policies can produce harmful unintended consequences, that progress in one area often requires sacrifice in another, and that reasonable people can disagree about fundamental questions of justice and social organization. Ideology offers escape from this burden by providing a master key that unlocks all problems. It promises that once you understand the correct theory, whether of class struggle, market efficiency, racial justice, or cultural tradition, all political questions become simple applications of known principles. This transforms the citizen from a prudential judge weighing imperfect alternatives into a scientist applying universal laws. The seductive power lies not just in intellectual simplification, but in moral certainty. Ideology tells us not only what is true, but what is good, and assures us that serving the good is both simple and scientifically guaranteed to succeed. Chapter 2: The Empirical Antidote to Ideological Thinking. The alternative to ideological thinking is not neutrality or indifference, but what I practiced as empirical engagement, the commitment to base political judgments on careful observation of actual circumstances rather than deductive application of theoretical principles. This approach begins with the recognition that political and social phenomena are too complex to be captured by any single theoretical framework, no matter how sophisticated. Human societies are not natural systems governed by discoverable laws, but historical constructions shaped by countless individual and collective choices, cultural inheritances, and contingent circumstances. Empirical thinking requires developing what scientists call negative capability, the ability to remain uncertain and curious when facing incomplete or contradictory evidence. Instead of rushing to judgment, the empirical thinker asks, what are the observable facts? What patterns can be discerned? What are the historical precedents? What are the likely consequences of different courses of action? Most importantly, what evidence would force me to revise my current understanding? This approach demands intellectual humility about the limits of social knowledge while maintaining confidence that careful observation can distinguish between more and less accurate descriptions of social reality. During my years of analyzing Soviet society, I found that this approach consistently yielded more accurate predictions than the elaborate theoretical constructions of my ideologically committed colleagues. While they were debating whether Soviet industrialization represented a higher form of rationality, I was studying actual production statistics, examining the real conditions of workers, and analyzing the institutional structures that govern decision-making. The empirical evidence clearly indicated fundamental economic inefficiencies and political pathologies that theory-driven observers either dismissed or failed to see. The planned economy produced chronic shortages, technological stagnation, and environmental destruction that contradicted theoretical predictions about socialist rationality. This same method proves equally valuable when analyzing contemporary American political issues. Rather than starting with predetermined positions about what government should or should not do, empirical thinking begins with questions. How do different policies actually function in practice? What are their intended and unintended consequences? How do similar policies work in different contexts? What can we learn from natural experiments and comparative analysis? Consider the complex relationship between economic inequality and social mobility. Ideological thinking tends to produce simple answers. Inequality is either beneficial because it rewards merit or harmful because it perpetuates injustice, while empirical analysis reveals that the relationship depends on institutional context, cultural factors, and specific policy designs. The empirical approach does not guarantee correct answers, but it does provide a reliable method for distinguishing between more and less accurate understanding. It forces us to confront uncomfortable realities that challenge our preferences, to acknowledge complexity that resists simple solutions, and to maintain intellectual humility about the limits of our knowledge. Most importantly, it preserves the possibility of learning from experience, something that ideological thinking systematically undermines by subordinating evidence to theoretical commitment. Chapter 3: Developing Independent Critical Judgment. The cultivation of independent critical judgment requires constant vigilance against the multiple pressures that encourage intellectual conformity. In democratic societies, these pressures are often more subtle but no less powerful than the crude propaganda of authoritarian regimes. They include the desire for social acceptance within ideological communities, the professional advantages of adhering to orthodox positions, the psychological comfort of belonging to groups that provide clear answers to complex questions, and the social media dynamics that reward extreme positions over nuanced analysis. I learned early in my career that intellectual independence often comes at a social cost. When I criticized the Communist Party while many of my university colleagues were expressing solidarity with Soviet socialism, I found myself excluded from certain circles and attacked as a defender of capitalism. My critique of Marxist historicism in The Opium of the Intellectuals was dismissed by many as reactionary propaganda, despite being based on careful analysis of both theoretical inconsistencies and empirical evidence. Later, when I questioned aspects of American foreign policy during the Vietnam era, I was criticized by conservative allies as insufficiently anti-communist. The price of independent thinking is often intellectual loneliness. But this loneliness is also a source of clarity. When we free ourselves from the need to maintain consistency with group positions, we become able to evaluate each issue on its own merits. We can support market mechanisms in some contexts while recognizing the need for government intervention in others. We can defend democratic values while acknowledging that democracy itself can produce illiberal outcomes. We can appreciate the achievements of our society while honestly confronting its failures and limitations. This requires what I called the discipline of critical distance, the ability to step back from immediate political pressures and partisan loyalties to examine issues from multiple perspectives. The development of critical judgment requires practicing what I called the discipline of the questioner. This means learning to interrogate not only the arguments of those with whom we disagree, but also the assumptions underlying positions we find attractive. It means asking uncomfortable questions. Why do I find this argument convincing? What evidence would challenge my current position? What are the strongest arguments on the other side? What am I not seeing because of my own biases and limitations? What interests might I have in believing what I currently believe? Independent critical judgment also requires cultivating genuine intellectual humility, the recognition that complex political and social issues rarely admit of perfect solutions, that reasonable people can disagree about fundamental values, and that unintended consequences are an inevitable feature of human action. This humility should not paralyze decision-making, but it should make us more thoughtful about the decisions we make and more open to correcting course when evidence suggests we have made mistakes. It means accepting that political wisdom consists more in avoiding catastrophic errors than in achieving ideal outcomes. Perhaps most challenging, developing independent judgment requires learning to distinguish between our analytical conclusions and our emotional preferences. We naturally want to believe that what we think is good is also what is true, but rigorous thinking demands separating these different kinds of judgments. We must be willing to accept that policies we morally prefer may not work in practice, while policies we find morally distasteful may sometimes be necessary for achieving important goals. Chapter 4: The Institutional Foundations of Clear Thinking. Clear thinking in political matters is not simply an individual virtue, it depends on institutional arrangements that protect and reward intellectual honesty. Democratic societies require what I called intermediate institutions that mediate between individual citizens and state power, creating spaces where independent critical analysis can flourish without being subordinated to immediate political pressures. These institutions serve as what we might call intellectual infrastructure for democracy, providing the social and cultural conditions that make rational public deliberation possible. Universities play a crucial role in this ecosystem, but only when they maintain genuine intellectual diversity and resist the temptation to become ideological training centers. When academic institutions become dominated by single worldviews, whether left or right, they lose their capacity to serve as sources of independent analysis. Students learn to repeat approved opinions rather than to think critically, and faculty members find their research and teaching constrained by orthodoxies that punish deviation. The transformation of many universities into institutions that prioritize ideological conformity over intellectual rigor represents a serious threat to democratic culture. A healthy university environment requires protecting spaces for genuine intellectual debate, where ideas can be evaluated on their merits rather than their political implications. This means defending academic freedom even when it produces conclusions that challenge popular beliefs or powerful interests. It means maintaining institutional cultures that reward originality, empirical rigor, and intellectual courage over ideological correctness. Universities should produce graduates who can think independently about complex issues, not activists trained to advance predetermined causes. The same principle applies to media institutions. A healthy democracy requires journalists and commentators who see their primary responsibility as investigating and reporting accurately rather than advancing political causes. This does not mean false neutrality or mechanical balance, but it does mean subordinating ideological preferences to empirical accuracy and intellectual honesty. News organizations should help citizens understand complex issues rather than manipulating them to support particular political outcomes. Professional organizations, think tanks, and civic associations also contribute to the institutional foundation of clear thinking when they maintain independence from political parties and ideological movements. These organizations can provide platforms for serious analysis of public policy issues that transcends partisan divisions and focuses on evidence-based evaluation of different approaches. They should serve as sources of expertise and analysis that citizens can trust to provide reliable information rather than sophisticated propaganda. Perhaps most importantly, democratic political institutions themselves must be designed to reward prudential judgment rather than ideological purity. Electoral systems that encourage politicians to appeal to broad coalitions rather than narrow bases, legislative procedures that require deliberation and compromise, and constitutional protections that prevent any single faction from imposing its complete agenda, all of these institutional features create incentives for the kind of thinking that democracy requires. The challenge for contemporary American democracy is that many of these institutional safeguards have been weakened by polarization, technological change, and the increasing domination of political discourse by activist minorities on both sides. Restoring the conditions for clear thinking requires not just individual intellectual virtue, but collective commitment to rebuilding institutions that support democratic deliberation. Chapter 5: Navigating Information Overload in the Digital Age. The contemporary challenge of thinking clearly about political issues has been enormously complicated by the sheer volume of information available to citizens and the technological mechanisms that shape how this information is presented and consumed. We face what previous generations could not have imagined, not scarcity of information, but such abundance that the critical task becomes learning to distinguish reliable from unreliable sources, significant from trivial developments, and genuine analysis from sophisticated propaganda designed to exploit our psychological vulnerabilities. The digital revolution has created what I would recognize as a new form of ideological manipulation, one that operates not through the crude censorship of authoritarian regimes, but through the sophisticated curation of information that confirms existing biases while creating the illusion of comprehensive knowledge. Social media algorithms and search engines present users with information that reinforces their pre-existing beliefs, creating what researchers call filter bubbles that function like voluntary propaganda systems. Citizens believe they are accessing diverse information sources while actually consuming increasingly narrow ranges of perspective that confirm their predetermined conclusions. This technological environment exploits fundamental features of human psychology that make us vulnerable to manipulation. We naturally seek information that confirms our existing beliefs and avoid information that challenges them. We tend to remember vivid anecdotes more than statistical data. We are more influenced by information that comes from sources we perceive as similar to ourselves than from sources we see as different. We mistake familiarity for accuracy and confidence for competence. These cognitive biases, which may have been adaptive in small-scale societies, become serious liabilities in complex information environments where sophisticated actors understand how to exploit them. The solution is not to retreat from digital information sources, but to develop what we might call digital literacy for democratic citizens. This requires understanding how information systems work, learning to seek out sources that challenge our assumptions, and practicing the kind of critical evaluation that previous generations applied to traditional media. It means actively seeking disconfirming evidence, reading primary sources rather than relying on summaries, and developing relationships with intellectually honest voices across the political spectrum. One crucial skill is learning to distinguish between information and analysis. Raw data about unemployment rates, crime statistics, or international events can be relatively objective, but the interpretation of this data inevitably involves judgments about causation, significance, and policy implications that reflect deeper philosophical and political commitments. Citizens need to become sophisticated consumers of analysis who can separate empirical claims from ideological interpretations, who understand that the same data can support different conclusions depending on the analytical framework applied. Another essential capability is developing patience for complexity and uncertainty. Digital media tends to reward simple, dramatic narratives that can be consumed quickly and shared easily. But most important political issues involve competing values, uncertain trade-offs, and consequences that unfold over years or decades. Clear thinking requires resisting the pressure for immediate judgment and maintaining intellectual humility about the limits of our understanding. Most fundamentally, navigating information overload requires maintaining commitment to truth as something independent of our political preferences. In an age when my truth and your truth are often treated as equally valid, democratic citizenship requires insisting that some claims about empirical reality are more accurate than others and that political arguments should be evaluated based on evidence rather than sincerity or good intentions. Chapter 6: Learning from International Comparisons. One of the most powerful antidotes to ideological thinking is systematic comparison with how other democratic societies handle similar challenges. Americans often debate political issues as if the United States were the only democracy in the world, or as if American arrangements were the only conceivable way to organize democratic governance. This parochialism impoverishes political imagination and prevents learning from the successes and failures of other societies. It also makes Americans vulnerable to ideological claims that present particular policy choices as inevitable rather than as decisions that could be made differently based on different values and priorities. During my years studying different democratic systems, I was consistently struck by how much could be learned from examining variations in institutional design, policy approaches, and cultural practices. Scandinavian countries demonstrate that extensive social welfare systems can coexist with dynamic market economies and high levels of individual freedom, challenging both progressive assumptions that capitalism necessarily produces poverty and conservative assumptions that social programs necessarily undermine economic growth. Switzerland shows how direct democracy can function effectively in complex modern societies, while also revealing the cultural and institutional prerequisites that make such systems workable. Germany illustrates how federal systems can balance national unity with regional diversity, and how democratic institutions can be designed to prevent the concentration of power that enabled historical catastrophes. The German experience also demonstrates how societies can honestly confront dark chapters in their history while building stable democratic institutions. Canada reveals how multicultural societies can maintain social cohesion while respecting difference, though it also shows the ongoing challenges of balancing unity and diversity in complex federal systems. These comparisons do not provide simple models for imitation. Each society's arrangements reflect particular historical experiences, cultural values, and demographic realities that cannot be easily transplanted. Swedish social democracy works within a context of cultural homogeneity, shared values, and high levels of social trust that may not exist in more diverse societies. Swiss direct democracy functions within institutions designed to protect minority interests and encourage compromise, and within a political culture that values deliberation over polarization. But international comparison does expand our sense of what is possible and challenge assumptions about what democracy requires or permits. It helps us distinguish between features of American politics that reflect universal challenges of democratic governance and those that reflect particular choices that could be made differently. It reveals that different democratic societies have found different ways to balance competing values like liberty and equality, efficiency and representation, majority rule and minority rights. International comparison also reveals the dangers of both excessive pessimism and naive optimism about democratic prospects. On one hand, observing how other democracies have weathered crises, adapted to changing circumstances, and maintained social solidarity despite deep differences should give Americans confidence that current challenges are not unprecedented or insurmountable. Democratic institutions have proven remarkably resilient across diverse contexts and historical periods, surviving economic depressions, world wars, social revolutions, and technological transformations. On the other hand, comparative analysis also reveals how democracies can decline, how polarization can undermine democratic norms, and how well-intentioned reforms can produce perverse consequences. The history of interwar Europe demonstrates how quickly democratic institutions can collapse when citizens lose faith in democratic processes and turn to extremist alternatives. More recent developments in Hungary, Poland, and Venezuela show how democratic forms can be maintained while democratic substance is gradually eroded through legal and constitutional manipulation. Chapter 7: Practical Guidelines for Democratic Citizenship. The cultivation of clear thinking about political issues ultimately serves the practical purpose of enabling more effective democratic citizenship. This requires translating intellectual virtues into habits of civic engagement that strengthen rather than undermine democratic institutions and democratic culture. The goal is not to produce citizens who agree about everything, but citizens who can disagree productively about important issues while maintaining commitment to democratic processes and mutual respect for human dignity. The first practical guideline is learning to distinguish between issues where citizens need to take definitive positions and those where the most responsible position is intellectual humility about complexity and uncertainty. Democratic citizenship requires making choices about candidates, policies, and constitutional questions, but it does not require having strong opinions about every political issue or technical policy question. Sometimes the most honest position is acknowledging that an issue requires expertise we do not possess or that reasonable people can disagree based on different values and priorities. A second guideline is practicing what I learned to call principled partisanship, the ability to support political parties and candidates while maintaining critical distance from their particular positions and strategies. Democracy requires organized political competition, which means citizens must choose between imperfect alternatives rather than waiting for perfect options. But this choice should be based on comparative evaluation rather than tribal loyalty, and it should be accompanied by willingness to criticize allies and acknowledge valid points made by opponents. This approach requires developing what we might call provisional commitment, the ability to support particular candidates or policies while remaining open to evidence that suggests better alternatives. It means distinguishing between core principles that should not be compromised and tactical positions that can be adjusted based on circumstances and evidence. Citizens should be able to explain why they support particular positions without demonizing those who disagree, and they should be willing to change their minds when presented with compelling evidence or arguments. The practice of democratic citizenship also requires developing tolerance for political disagreement and respect for democratic procedures even when they produce outcomes we dislike. This does not mean passive acceptance of all political developments, but it does mean channeling opposition through democratic means and maintaining commitment to constitutional principles that protect minority rights and ensure opportunities for peaceful change of government. It means accepting that democracy sometimes produces bad policies that must be tolerated until they can be changed through democratic processes. Perhaps most importantly, Effective democratic citizenship requires taking responsibility for the quality of public discourse and democratic culture. This means refusing to share information we have not verified, avoiding personal attacks on political opponents, seeking out diverse perspectives, and modeling the kind of respectful debate that democracy requires. It means supporting institutions and individuals who prioritize truth over partisan advantage and intellectual honesty over ideological purity. Citizens should also practice what I called intellectual charity, the discipline of representing opposing arguments in their strongest form rather than attacking straw men, and assuming good faith on the part of political opponents unless proven otherwise. This does not mean accepting all arguments as equally valid, but it does mean engaging seriously with the best versions of opposing positions rather than dismissing them based on their worst proponents. The goal is not to eliminate disagreement or achieve consensus on contested issues, but to ensure that democratic debate is conducted in ways that respect human dignity, acknowledge complexity, and remain open to evidence and argument. When citizens practice these intellectual virtues in their political engagement, they contribute to the health of democratic institutions and democratic culture that make free government possible for future generations. Conclusion. The method of clear thinking I have outlined here offers no guarantee of political wisdom or perfect solutions to the challenges facing democratic societies. What it does provide is a reliable approach to distinguishing between better and worse arguments, more and less accurate understanding, and more and less responsible forms of political engagement. In an age of information warfare and ideological polarization, these intellectual virtues become essential tools of democratic citizenship. The alternative to disciplined thinking is not passion or commitment, but vulnerability to manipulation by those who understand how to exploit our cognitive biases and emotional needs. Democracy requires citizens capable of thinking clearly, not because clear thinking guarantees right answers, but because it provides the best available protection against systematic deception and self-deception. The practice of intellectual independence, empirical honesty, and methodological skepticism remains our most reliable defense against the seductive simplicities that threaten democratic judgment in every generation. This is not merely an individual responsibility, but a collective necessity for maintaining the institutional and cultural foundations that make democratic life possible. When enough citizens commit to these practices, they create the social conditions necessary for democratic deliberation, compromise, and peaceful resolution of conflicts that characterize healthy democratic societies.